4 in the morning, October 14th. A trail camera mounted on an old oak tree in an abandoned wildlife reserve in Ohio triggered on its own when the motion sensor caught something moving. 7 seconds. That's all the footage captured. Second one, a full-grown Bengal tiger, the same animal that had escaped its enclosure 3 weeks earlier during a massive storm, bursts into frame, snarling hard, muscles coiled like it's about to pounce. The second 3, a massive shape, covered in black fur, rises up out of the brush, blocking the tiger's path, dead center. Second 5, another roar cuts through, deeper than anything before it, strong enough to shake the camera lens slightly. Second 7, both of them vanish from frame. 3 days later, the tiger was found nearly 2 miles away, panicked, but without a single wound on it. What do you think happened in those 7 seconds? Drop the second you think was the turning point in the comments below. Diane Okafor walked into her cramped little office at the Muskingum County Ranger Station on a late September morning, a cup of coffee in her hand that had already gone cold on the drive in, and let her eyes settle on the map pinned to the wall behind her desk, the one where her patch of the county sat boxed off in a crooked red line, wrapping around nearly 400 acres of forest and overgrown pasture that anybody who'd lived in that part of the state long enough still called by a name that never made it onto any county document, but that everybody understood anyway. The Voss place. She set the coffee down, dropped into the same worn-out swivel chair that had been hers since her very first day on this job, and settled in for a morning she already knew wasn't going to be an easy one, same as every other morning had gone for 3 straight weeks running now. 39 years old, 12 years wearing the badge, Diane had taken this territory over from the ranger before her about 4 years back, and in all that time, she'd never once felt fully at ease walking the old overgrown trails that cut deeper into the property, out past where the grass swallowed up the leftovers of a past that wasn't exactly a proud one. Cracked concrete slabs where animal pens used to stand. Loops of rusted barbed wire half buried in the brush, curling like something dead. And every so often, one of those old metal warning signs, the paint gone gray and flaking, still nailed crooked to a rotted fence post, still warning about dangerous animals to anybody who bothered to read it, a warning nobody had cared enough to take down in more than 10 years. Harlan Voss had run that land for better than 20 years, going all the way back to the early 90s, right up until the federal government shut the whole operation down for good in 2011. In the wake of something that anybody who'd been living anywhere in the Midwest at the time still remembered clear as day. Dozens of large animals, lions among them, tigers, a handful of exotic primates too, all turned loose from their cages in a single chaotic night whose real cause never did get pinned down for certain. Not officially, though plenty of theories had made the rounds in the years since, whispered over coffee and never quite settled. That night turned into one of the most talked about disasters in the whole history of wildlife management in that part of the country. And it pushed the federal government into tightening up the rules on private exotic animal ownership across the entire nation. Voss himself never faced criminal charges over it, since investigators never could prove for certain whether he was the one who'd opened those cages that night or not. But he lost his license all the same, and was forced to shut the farm down permanently, and he cleared out not long after, moved off somewhere that hardly anybody left in that county could tell you the name of. From that point forward, the sprawling piece of land that used to be Voss's farm got placed under special watch by the state's Ranger Service, with part of it converted into a limited-access public reserve, while the rest stayed in private hands, locked out of any kind of animal, keeping under the new rules that came down after the whole disaster. A handful of the exotic animals left behind from the old farm got picked up by professional rescue outfits in the following months, and moved somewhere with better facilities to look after them. But according to the official files, Diane had gone through back when she first took this post over 4 years ago. There were others, a few of them, that were never accounted for after the 2011 incident, leaving a gap in the record that nobody at the agency much liked to bring up, since it dragged along too many unanswered questions and too much messy legal liability that no office wanted to be the one holding the bag for. And that's exactly why that particular late September morning felt so heavy to Diane, a weight that had been piling up day after day since the whole thing started. 3 weeks back, an unusually vicious storm had rolled straight through southeastern Ohio, throwing gusts north of 70 miles an hour and dumping rain for nearly 12 hours without let-up, knocking the power out across a stretch of the county wide enough to affect tens of thousands of homes, and toppling trees and old, already sagging structures along the way. One piece of the damage not treated as urgent at first, since the emergency crews were still tied up handling situations that put people directly at risk, was the electric perimeter fence over at a small private animal rescue facility, sitting less than 3 miles from the edge of Diane's reserve. That fence took heavy damage in the storm, and the power feeding it went dark for hours before a maintenance crew could get out there and patch it the following morning. That rescue facility, run by a small non-profit working with a tight budget, was home to a handful of Bengal tigers, pulled out of Harlan Voss's old farm back after the 2011 incident, animals too old by now, or too used to a life behind fencing, to ever be candidates for release back into the wild, and so they'd spent more than a decade living out their remaining years inside secure, fenced enclosures at that facility, kept safe, and fed in a tightly controlled world that still, no matter how well managed, never quite matched the raw, wild instinct they'd been born carrying somewhere deep down. Among them was an adult male, somewhere around 8 years old, by the staff's best estimate, one of the biggest and healthiest animals the facility had, given a name off the record by the people who fed him every day, but logged in the official paperwork under nothing but a tracking number, strictly for management purposes. The night that storm hit, once the fence lost power, that tiger found a soft spot along one corner of the perimeter, a place where months of rain had been quietly washing out the ground underneath, without anybody catching it in time, since the facility's inspection schedule wasn't tight enough to have flagged it. He slipped out sometime around midnight, near as the security staff could figure, based on the last time the cameras caught his image inside the enclosure before the signal cut out entirely in the storm's wider power failure. A search team was out looking that same night, but the weather was brutal enough, and the terrain out there tangled and thick enough that the early efforts barely amounted to anything. Visibility dropped to almost nothing in the driving rain and wind, bad enough that even the search team itself had trouble moving safely through it. By the next morning, once the storm had blown through and the visibility cleared up some, the search widened out to cover the whole surrounding area, including the ground under Diane's watch. But for days on end, they turned up nothing solid, nothing but a few faint prints near a creek bank that even the tracking specialists couldn't say for certain belonged to the tiger and not to something else out there, seeing as the area carried a healthy population of black bear and deer too. Diane, as the ranger in charge of the ground most likely to be hiding the tiger based on the terrain and where the water sources sat, carried a heavy load over the weeks that followed, as word of the whole situation spread fast through the scattered little community ringing. The reserve, plenty of families out there with small farms or houses standing just a few hundred feet off the tree line. Her phone rang off the hook, dozens of calls a day from worried folks, some wanting constant updates on how the search was going, others coming right out and saying they were angry, that they felt the county wasn't moving fast enough or hard enough to keep them and their livestock safe, and a few even asked outright if they could arm themselves to protect their own property if the county couldn't promise them safety in time. That kind of pressure sat on Diane's shoulders in a way nothing had in her whole 12 years on the job. She understood full well just how much danger a full-grown Bengal tiger could pose, even one that had spent years living behind a fence and maybe didn't hold on to the sharp hunting instincts of its wild ancestors anymore, if it felt cornered or hungry enough to start looking for food close to where people lived. And she understood, too, that every day that tiger stayed unfound, the odds of it running into somebody out there kept climbing, a possibility she did not want hanging over her name by the time this was all said and done. After close to 2 weeks of searching that turned up next to nothing, working off nothing but ground patrols and a couple of drone flights that gave back nothing more than blurry shots of thick canopy, Diane brought a different plan to her supervisor, stringing a network of thermal trail cameras along every major path running through the reserve, with a heavy focus on the stretches bordering farmland and homes, where she figured, based on conversations with wildlife behavior specialists she'd been calling up on more than a few late nights, the tiger was most likely to be passing through looking for water and something to eat. The proposal got approved fast, given the urgency of the situation and the mounting pressure from the community, and word came back from her supervisor faster than she'd even expected, practically before she'd finished laying out the reasoning behind it. Within 4 days, a technical crew had finished mounting 18 thermal sensor cameras along the whole network of trails winding through the reserve, every single unit wired into an automatic data storage system that Diane could pull up remotely each morning through an app on her tablet, saving her a considerable amount of time compared to the old way of doing things, back when somebody had to physically hike out to each unit just to swap out a memory card. This was the first time in her whole career that Diane found herself running a surveillance operation on this kind of scale just to track down a single animal. And every single morning when she opened that app to look through the previous night's data, she felt a low hum of tension settle into her chest, part of her hoping she'd find some kind of lead on the tiger that could finally put an end to this whole drawn-out state of alarm, and another part of her dreading that any image showing up at all might mean bad news about some encounter that had already happened somewhere out there before she'd even had the chance to hear about it. Diane also couldn't help but think about the strange history of this land every time she drove those dirt roads leading deeper into the reserve to check on and maintain the newly installed cameras. She'd heard no shortage of stories from the older folks around the county, people who still remembered clearly the days when Harlan Voss's farm was up and running, stories about strange sounds carrying out of the woods at night, tales told half-joking and half-serious over coffee at the local diner, about what had really gone down during that chaotic night back in 2011, when not every animal that got loose from those cages ever turned up again. Some people still believed, even without a shred of official evidence in any file anywhere, that this forest was holding onto more secrets than the Ranger Service had ever caught wind of, secrets that up until that point Diane had always chalked up as idle gossip from bored old-timers with too much time on their hands ends, right up until things started shifting on a morning in early October. Over the first 2 weeks after the full network of 18 thermal cameras went live, the results coming back weren't anything close to what Diane had been hoping for. Every morning, she'd open the app on her tablet, scroll through the list of triggers logged overnight, and not one single time did any of it show the Bengal tiger. This whole expensive setup had been built to find, Instead, she got the same familiar, short clips of ordinary forest life, over and over. A mother black bear leading 2 cubs across the western trail at dawn. A flock of wild turkeys foraging along the creek bank. Every now and then, a red fox darting quickly through the frame at night. Harmless footage repeating itself night after night until she started wondering whether this whole costly camera system was just burning through the department's already tight budget for nothing. That long stretch of absence, instead of bringing any comfort the way some of Diane's coworkers joked it might, saying maybe the tiger had found its own way out of the area or died of hunger and dehydration somewhere out there, only made her more restless. 12 years in this line of work had taught Diane one basic rule. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially not for an animal as intelligent and naturally elusive as a tiger, an apex predator that had evolved over millions of years to move in near total silence and steer clear of anything that might threaten its safety, including modern technology that people had strung up along every trail it might have already learned to recognize and avoid. But even without a single direct image of the tiger, the data pulled from the camera network over those 2 weeks still showed some indirect signs that kept Diane from fully ruling out the possibility that the animal was still alive and moving somewhere inside the reserve's boundary. Skillfully staying just out of reach of every piece of equipment her team had worked so hard to install. The first sign showed up on the 5th day after the system went live, when Diane noticed a clear break in the usual behavior of the white-tailed deer that regularly showed up along the northeastern trail, the section closest to the border of the rescue facility where the tiger had escaped from. Over her years managing this area, Diane had gotten familiar with the fairly steady movement patterns of the local deer, the routes they'd typically take between grazing spots and water sources. Patterns she'd tracked through years of observation and data from the reserve's older camera system. But the data from 3 cameras strung along that familiar route showed a sudden shift. Nearly the entire herd, estimated at somewhere between 12 and 15 animals based on earlier sightings, had completely stopped using that route for 4 straight days, an unusually long gap for a species that normally showed high consistency in its daily feeding habits, based on everything Diane had observed over her years working this territory. When Diane reached out to a hoofed mammal ecology specialist at the state university, someone she'd been in contact with since the beginning of this whole situation, the specialist explained that this kind of sudden, coordinated shift in behavior across a large deer herd usually only happens when a significant new threat shows up in the area, which lined up with the theory that the tiger was moving along that route, even though not a single camera had captured a direct image of it the whole time. Still, the specialist also flagged a detail that left Diane feeling more unsettled than reassured. The scale of this behavioral shift, with the entire herd avoiding a large stretch of territory completely for several days in a row, rather than just showing more caution while passing through, was typically only seen when the perceived threat was especially severe, well beyond the level of danger a single tiger, even as an apex predator, would normally pose to a deer herd that large out in the wild. The second sign turned up close to the end of the 2nd week, tied to the strange disappearance of small animals along a specific stretch of trail in the southern part of the reserve, not far from where the first camera had picked up the shift in the deer herd's behavior. For months before this, that stretch of trail had been well known in Diane's camera data for its high activity levels of small animals, especially cottontail rabbits and gray squirrels, species that regularly showed up in short clips logged multiple times a day across all 4 seasons of the year. But over 3 straight days, starting on October the 11th, the 2 cameras positioned along that stretch recorded almost no activity at all from those small animals, a silence noticeable enough that one of the technicians assisting Diane initially wondered if the equipment itself had malfunctioned, until they checked it and confirmed both cameras were working completely normally, still picking up other environmental details like leaves stirring in the wind or light shifting throughout the day, simply with no small animals showing up in frame at all during those 3 days. The sudden and complete absence of small animals in a specific area, according to the ecologist Diane consulted, is typically a sign of a predator's nearby presence, one that these smaller species carry a strong instinctive drive to avoid, a phenomenon researchers refer to as a landscape of fear, describing how the mere presence of a predator can reshape the behavior of an entire surrounding ecosystem, even when the predator itself never once shows up directly within range of human observation or equipment. But the detail that left Diane feeling the most uneasy, a feeling she kept mostly to herself out of worry it would sound unprofessional to her coworkers, came on the night of October the 12th, 2 days before the main event this whole story centers on. One of the cameras positioned along the eastern boundary, close to the remaining stretch of old fencing left over from Harlan Voss's farm, logged a trigger around 3 in the morning. But the clip it captured, only 4 seconds long, showed nothing but a large patch of darkness, passing briefly along the right edge of the frame before disappearing completely. Not enough detail to make out any specific shape. When Diane reviewed that clip for the first time the next morning, her initial reaction, much like the technical teams when she sent it over for them to check, was to suspect it was simply a sensor glitch or image noise caused by low light conditions at night, a not uncommon issue for mid-range thermal sensor cameras operating in high humidity or with big temperature swings between day and night during a seasonal transition. The technical team went over that unit thoroughly and found no sign of any hardware malfunction. But they couldn't offer any definitive explanation either, beyond the possibility that it was just random image noise with no particular significance. Still, there was one detail in that clip Diane couldn't stop turning over in her mind, even though she couldn't quite put it into clear words, not even to herself. The size of that patch of darkness, based on comparing it against other fixed objects in the frame, like the tree trunk and the boulder positioned in front of the camera, appeared noticeably larger than any animal ever recorded in this area before, including a full-grown black bear, the largest species on record for the reserve up until that point. Diane didn't mention that thought to anybody on her team, partly because she recognized on her own how unreasonable and scientifically thin it sounded, not fitting the image of a level-headed professional ranger she'd always tried to maintain throughout her career, but mostly because she genuinely didn't know how to put that feeling into words in any way that would make sense to coworkers who'd always seen her as the calmest, most grounded person on the team. It wasn't quite fear in the ordinary sense. It was more a lingering, formless unease, a persistent hunch that the forest she'd spent 12 years of her career protecting and managing was hiding something that fell outside. Everything she thought she understood about this ecosystem, something far bigger than a simple lost Bengal tiger trying to find its way home. That feeling only grew sharper every time Diane thought back to the old stories she'd heard from longtime residents about the history of this land under Harlan Voss, stories she'd always brushed off before as baseless rumor, the product of imagination and the boredom of rural life, where every strange tale only grew more elaborate with each retelling. But now, sitting alone in her office late into the evening, replaying that faint 4-second clip over and over, she started wondering whether she'd been too quick to dismiss those stories entirely, or whether there was some grain of truth buried somewhere beneath all that folklore the local community had spun. and embellished over the years. She didn't share any of these thoughts with her supervisors in her weekly status reports, only logging the observable events as objective data. The shift in deer behavior, the disappearance of small animals, one unexplained camera trigger, all of it presented in strictly professional terms without any personal speculation about what any of it might really mean. Exactly the kind of reporting style she'd trained herself into over 12 years on the job. But deep down, Diane knew she was waiting for something, even if she couldn't say exactly what, a feeling suspended somewhere between worry and curiosity that she'd never experienced before in her whole ranger career. And that feeling only grew more intense as October the 14th drew closer, though of course at the time, there was no way for her to know that the night ahead would bring an answer she'd never prepared herself to receive, one that would change forever the way she saw the forest she'd spent her whole career tied to. Before we take a look at exactly what that camera caught on the night of October the 14th, if you're finding this story gripping enough to wait for one backed up by real footage, go ahead and drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach more people out there. Now, back to the night of October the 14th. That night, same as every other night over the previous 2 weeks, the network of 18 cameras kept right on, working quietly, along every trail through the reserve, logging every flicker of movement, every heat signature that showed up out of the darkness, with absolutely no idea that in just a few hours, one of them was about to capture footage that would send this whole situation spinning in a direction nobody, not even Diane, with all her nagging unease, could have possibly seen coming. Every morning for the past 2 weeks, Diane's routine had stayed pretty much the same. Brew a cup of coffee, pull up the camera management app on her tablet the moment she sat down at her desk, and scroll through the list of triggers logged overnight before starting anything else. It had become an almost automatic habit by now, a small ritual to kick off her workday, usually taking no more than 15 minutes, since most of the triggers were nothing but short, harmless clips of ordinary forest life. Footage that, after 2 weeks, she could practically predict just from the trigger time and camera location alone. On the morning of October the 15th, Diane got to the office about half an hour earlier than usual, partly because she hadn't been sleeping well the past few nights, her mind still snagged on that faint 4-second clip from 2 nights earlier that she hadn't managed to find a satisfying explanation for. Even after checking with both the technical team and an old friend who worked in wildlife conservation over in the neighboring state, she made her coffee like always, sat down at her desk, opened the app, and started scrolling through the overnight trigger list, planning to move through it quickly so she could still make the 8 o'clock briefing with the ground search team, a meeting she already knew would be packed with questions she still didn't have any good answers for. That night's list showed a total of 7 triggers, scattered from 9 the previous evening to nearly 6 in the morning, most of them coming from cameras positioned in the central part of the reserve, where wildlife activity was still going about its business as usual, no matter what tension had been hanging over the past few weeks. Diane clicked through each clip almost mechanically. A deer crossing the northern trail at 10 at night, a skunk poking around the base of a tree at midnight, a great horned owl perched on a branch near another camera at 2 in the morning, until she reached the file timestamped at 4:03 in the morning from Camera 11, positioned along a rarely used stretch of trail on the eastern edge of the reserve, close to the border where what was left of the old fencing from Voss's farm still stood, the same general area where that mysterious 4-second clip had been captured 2 nights before. She clicked into that file with no more attention than she'd given any of the others before it. No special hunch warning her this was about to be the moment that complete completely changed how she saw the forest she'd spent 12 years of her career tied to. The video started loading, the progress bar crawling along slowly for a few seconds since the internet connection at the ranger station wasn't always reliable, especially early in the morning when a bunch of devices were syncing data all at once. And when the image finally came up on screen, Diane set her coffee down on the desk without even thinking about it, eyes locked onto the frame that was now playing. The first second of the footage showed a slightly blurred image, typical of a thermal sensor camera trying to capture something moving fast under the extremely low light of pre-dawn, before the sun had come up and the ambient temperature had dropped to its lowest point of the day. A large heat signature came tearing across the frame from left to right, the long, low-profile characteristic of a big cat, its whole body coiled in that textbook hunting posture that Diane, even though she'd never seen it in person, had studied enough documentation on tiger behavior to recognize instantly, back arched slightly, all four legs loaded up for a launch, tail whipping side to side in that distinctive rhythm that signals an animal locked into a state of extreme excitement, gearing up to strike some target sitting just out of frame ahead of it, probably some small prey it had already been stalking before it ever crossed into the camera's range. The second brought the first thing that made Diane feel like something was off, a feeling she registered even before she could put a finger on exactly why. The tiger, instead of carrying through the momentum of the charge it had started building in the previous second, suddenly locked up mid-stride, all four paws nearly, sliding out from under it on the damp ground as it tried to slam the brakes, a move that requires an incredibly abrupt shift in the animal's center of gravity. This isn't normal behavior for a big cat once it's already committed to the final phase of a hunt. Through all the research Diane had done into tiger behavior over the previous weeks, consulting with a whole range of specialists to prepare for the search effort, she'd never once come across any documentation describing a full-grown tiger abruptly stopping mid-strike after already launching one, not unless some extremely powerful disruption suddenly entered its field of view, something its survival instinct forced it to reassess immediately before continuing. The third second was the moment that, later on, whenever Diane had to describe it to her supervisors and coworkers in one emergency meeting after another, she noticed she always had to pause for a beat before continuing, as if even putting it into words demanded some effort beyond her usual ability with language. On the left edge of the frame, a large, dark mass began rising up out of a thick patch of brush that had completely blocked the camera's thermal sensor from picking anything up until that exact moment, as if it had been there all along, hidden, waiting in absolute silence, without a single motion sensor ever catching it. The height of that dark shape, even just partway through, standing up straight, already exceeded the outline of any animal body ever recorded in the reserve's camera data over the years, including every instance of a black bear standing upright on its hind legs to look around, a common enough posture for that species but one that had never come close to the proportions Diane was watching unfold on her screen right now. The fur covering this thing's entire body was a uniform dark color, dense enough that it didn't scatter heat the fragmented way normal mammal fur usually does on a thermal camera, instead forming one unbroken, unusually solid block of heat on the screen, almost a single dense mass, rather than the scattered streaks of warmth you'd typically expect from an animal's coat. The fourth and fifth seconds made up a stretch of time that, in every single one of her later rewatches, Diane always felt stretched out far longer than the actual 2 seconds ticking by on the video's timestamp. The tiger, now fully stopped, stood facing straight on with the massive dark shape that had just appeared, its body still holding that same rigid tension. But the direction of that energy had shifted completely. no longer the posture of an animal actively preparing to strike, but something closer to a defensive assessment of an opponent, a behavior typical of a predator suddenly confronted with a threat it's never encountered before in its entire life spent inside a controlled, captive environment. The tiger's snarl, even though the camera wasn't fitted with any high-quality microphone, still came through clearly enough on the basic audio pickup built into the unit, a continuous, rapid string of sound characteristic of an extreme state of alertness that anybody who's ever heard a big cat's warning growl would recognize instantly. But what made Diane pause the video and sit in silence for a few seconds before continuing was the sound coming from the shape, standing across from the tiger. It was a growl pitched far lower, at a frequency so low that, according to the technical analysis Diane's team later ran using more specialized equipment borrowed from a university acoustics lab, it produced enough vibration to cause a faint distortion in the image at that exact moment, a phenomenon the sound engineer brought in to analyze it. Later confirmed was the signature of a sound source with an intensity far beyond anything a standard thermal trail camera had ever picked up from any animal in the region before, including recorded roars from full-grown black bears caught in territorial confrontations, all stored in the department's reference database. The 6th second brought another shift in the tiger's behavior that Diane, after consulting again with big cat behavior specialists at a major zoo in the region, was told is extremely rare to see in the wild. The animal began lowering its body, not into a pouncing crouch but into a much more submissive posture, its tail tucked tightly between its hind legs, an expression of submission or acknowledged defeat that a tiger, given its position as one of the apex predators in nearly every ecosystem it inhabits, rarely displays toward any natural rival, except sometimes in front of a full-grown elephant or during direct confrontations with armed humans, something it may have learned to fear through years of experience living in captivity. The 7th second, the final second of the entire clip, captured the moment both figures moved out of frame at the exact same time, heading in the same direction toward the right, almost perfectly in sync with each other. So much so that Diane, watching it for the first time, got the distinct impression the tiger was being led away, or forced to move in a specific direction, rather than fleeing on its own, according to the ordinary instinct of a frightened animal trying to escape in whatever random direction offered the fastest way out. After that, the frame held on nothing but the quiet brush, no further sign of movement anywhere, and the camera's sensor automatically stopped recording, per its standard settings, once it failed to detect any more heat activity in the monitored area for the next 10 seconds. Diane sat frozen in front of the screen for a long moment after the clip ended, her finger still resting on the mouse but not moving it, the early morning light starting to creep through the office window without her even noticing. Then she hit play again, watched the whole 7 seconds one more time, and then again after that, each time trying to focus on a different detail, wondering if she was missing something that could offer a more reasonable, more ordinary explanation for what she'd just witnessed, an explanation she could actually bring to her supervisors without sounding like she was exaggerating or letting her imagination run away with her. She tried out the possibility that it was an unusually large black bear standing upright, the only animal in the area with a body size big enough to produce a heat signature that large while standing on its hind legs. But the standing posture of the shape in the footage, based on the proportions of its upper limbs and the overall balance of its body, didn't quite match the anatomy of a black bear that Diane had observed plenty of times over her career. Since black bears standing upright typically only hold that posture briefly and tend to sway slightly to maintain balance, while the figure in this footage held itself completely steady throughout the whole confrontation with the tiger, without a single sign of losing balance, even for a fleeting instant. She also tried considering the possibility that this was some kind of complex image artifact, maybe brush moving in the wind, combined with some unusual light reflection creating the illusion of a large shape, but that theory collapsed quickly once she focused on the deliberate, consistent movement of that dark mass. From rising up, to holding its confrontational posture, to moving out of frame in a specific direction, all of it carrying a continuity and internal logic that random image noise simply couldn't produce that consistently over a full 7 seconds. Straight, a stretch of time long enough to rule out the possibility that it was just a passing technical glitch. The more she watched it, the more Diane couldn't come up with a single species officially documented in this area, or anywhere across southeastern Ohio, based on her professional knowledge after 12 years working in this field, that could match what she'd just witnessed, not in shape, not in size, and especially not in the sound it produced, strong enough to create measurable vibration on the camera's basic audio recording equipment. The vague sense of unease she'd been carrying for the past 2 weeks, from the deer herd's strange behavioral shift to that faint 4-second clip 2 nights earlier, was no longer some hard-to-name hunch anymore. It now had a definite shape, an estimable height, a sound she could run frequency analysis on, and a fixed 7-second runtime that she knew she'd end up watching many more times before she could decide what her next move needed to be, and whether she had the nerve to bring this truth to people who weren't going to easily believe anything that fell outside the normal bounds of ordinary scientific understanding. Diane didn't waste another minute after watching the clip through for the 5th time. She got on the phone directly with her supervisor, Regional Director Warren Pruitt, skipping the usual written report process entirely given how urgent the situation was, and asked him to pull up the video right away over a remote screen sharing connection. That call, according to what Diane recounted afterward, ran nearly 45 minutes long, most of it spent in silence while Pruitt watched the clip over and over on his end, broken up by short questions about the reliability of the equipment and the possibility of a technical error, questions Diane had already anticipated and prepared answers for, based on the checks her technical team had run over the previous 2 days, leaving no small detail unaccounted for that might raise doubt. By the end of the call, Pruitt landed on a decision that Diane, even though she'd been hoping for it, still wasn't fully certain he'd sign off on, pulling together every available resource to significantly expand the scale of the tiger search. No longer limited to the boundaries of the reserve she directly managed, but bringing in coordination with neighboring counties and a specialized large animal unit from the state's central office. That decision, the way Pruitt put it during the call, didn't come from him buying into any theory about a mysterious creature showing up in the footage, but simply because the potential danger of the situation had now gone far beyond anything they'd originally prepared for. A full-grown tiger in a state of extreme panic, moving at an unpredictable pace after just going through an encounter that forced it, an apex predator in its own right, to display a kind of submissive behavior never before documented in any research material their team had access to. The next morning, October the 15th, the expanded search team officially deployed, with a total of 23 people taking part directly, including rangers pulled in from 3 different counties, a specialized large animal tracking unit sent out from the Central State Office, and 2 handlers working dogs trained specifically to pick up the scent of big cats. Diane, even though she technically wasn't the lead on this expanded operation anymore, was kept on in a field advisory role, given her deep knowledge of the local terrain, and she sat in on every morning briefing alongside the newly appointed team lead sent from the central office, a woman named Rosalind Vance, who carried nearly 20 years of experience handling large animal escapes from captivity all across the state, a reputation that had traveled well ahead of her through Ohio's ranger community, enough that the younger members of the team were visibly deferential to her from the very first meeting. The first day of the expanded operation focused mainly on the area surrounding Camera 11, the spot where the footage had been captured, in the hope that the tiger, even though it had moved out of frame, would still be sticking somewhere, within a reasonably close radius, based on the typical territorial instincts of a big cat, still unfamiliar with the new environment around it. The tracking dogs were brought in early that morning, while the dew still sat heavy on the grass. And at first, they picked up the scent quickly right at the camera's location, an encouraging sign that had the whole team feeling optimistic about the chances of pinning down the animal's location fast, right there on the very first day of the expanded campaign. But that scent trail, according to the lead handler's report, a man named Frank Delgado, only held for about 300 feet before disappearing, abruptly and strangely at a small clearing, with no sign at all that the tiger had continued moving in any direction from that point, a phenomenon that Delgado, with nearly 15 years of experience, tracking dogs across all kinds of situations statewide, admitted was rare and hard to explain, usually only happening when the tracked animal is suddenly transported by some vehicle, or when there's a deliberate interference, disrupting the scent trail from some outside source, something he'd never once run into before in his career. Through that entire first day, and most of the second day of the search, Vance's team turned up no other reliable sign of the tiger anywhere near where the footage had been captured, a situation that left the whole team baffled, since it ran completely counter to everything they'd expected, based on past experience with similar large animal search operation they'd carried out in other states. In the 2 weeks before the footage was captured, the tiger, even though it had never once shown up directly on camera, had still left enough indirect signs, through changes in other animals' behavior in the area, to convince the search team it was moving within a relatively confined range, not too far from the central part of the reserve where it could find water and small prey to keep itself alive. But after the night of October the 14th, every trace of it seemed to vanish from that area entirely, as if the animal had been pushed out of its familiar territory, suddenly and decisively, never once coming back, not even to look for food or water like it had before. By the afternoon of the second day, with no leads turning up anywhere within a 2-mile radius of Camera 11, despite a thorough sweep of every bush and creek bed in that stretch, Vance made the call to significantly widen the search area, breaking the team up into smaller groups to cover far more ground than originally planned, including agricultural land and sparsely populated residential areas outside the reserve's official boundary, a decision that considerably ramped up anxiety in the local community. Once word of the expanded search spread fast through social media groups and conversations at the local general store, where everybody was speculating about what exactly might be lurking out there in the woods. Diane, over those 2.5 days, barely had a moment of real rest, moving constantly between the staging points of the different search groups, providing terrain information and fielding an endless stream of calls from worried residents, all while still keeping up her monitoring duties for the 8 cameras that were still running. Though now she checked them with a far more complicated state of mind than she'd had 2 weeks earlier, hoping to find more leads on the tiger, while also carrying a new kind of dread she'd never had to face before, over the possibility that the cameras might catch another appearance of the creature that had confronted the tiger. A possibility she found herself both hoping for and dreading at the exact same time, not sure which outcome she wanted more. The exhaustion building up day after day wasn't just taking a toll on the search team. Physically, it was creating real psychological pressure, too, especially once word of the footage, despite the department's efforts to keep it contained internally, started leaking out through informal conversations between search team members and their families and friends. And before long, rumors began spreading fast through the small community surrounding the reserve, turning what should have been a routine animal search into the most talked-about topic in the whole region for weeks on end. By the morning of the third day, some team members started openly voicing doubt and unease about what they were really searching for, no longer certain whether their job was simply locating a lost tiger or something far more complicated that none of them had been trained to handle. And a few even quietly asked to be pulled from the operation, citing personal health reasons, not willing to admit to the real fear creeping into them. Diane, in the rare moments she got to sit alone in the evening and eat a quick meal before getting back to work, kept finding herself circling back to a question she couldn't stop thinking about. What could possibly drive a full-grown Bengal tiger, an animal that sits at the top of the food chain in its natural environment, with no significant natural enemy besides humans, to move with enough speed and panic to completely vanish from every ordinary tracking method for nearly 3 days straight without stopping? She'd seen large animals evade human search efforts for days before over the course of her career, but never with this kind of thorough, mysterious totality, as if the tiger wasn't simply hiding out of ordinary survival instinct, but was genuinely running from something it judged to be a threat far beyond its own ability to handle, a primal fear that none of its natural prey had ever been capable of provoking in it during its whole life in a controlled environment. Toward the end of the afternoon on the third day, with morale among the search team dropping noticeably after 3 straight days of work, with nothing concrete to show for it, an unexpected call came into the Ranger Service's emergency line that completely changed the direction of the entire operation. The caller, a woman named Carol Weiss, living on a small farm nearly 2 miles south of the edge of the reserve, an area outside the original search zone that Vance's team had only just extended into that same day, reported that she'd spotted a large animal, unable to say exactly what species, hiding in the crawl space beneath the floor of her family's old barn since early that morning. And the animal, based on her initial description over the phone, seemed panicked and showed no sign of aggression at all, just lying motionless in the dark, letting out small, fearful growls every so often whenever a loud noise came from outside, worrying her enough that she didn't dare step out of her house until somebody from the Ranger Service could come check things out for her. Diane arrived at Carol Weiss's farm less than 20 minutes after that call, riding along with a specialized 6-person rescue team led by Rosalind Vance, together with veterinarian Felix Raymond, who'd been on standby since the start of the operation specifically to prepare for a situation exactly like this, bringing along the full set of specialized tranquilizer equipment used for large animals the size of a tiger, gear he typically only used when working at professional rescue facilities, or on the rare occasions he was called in to assist a zoo in the region. As the team approached the barn, an old wood structure built decades earlier, with its foundation raised about 3 feet off the ground, creating a dark crawl space underneath big enough for a large animal to squeeze into and hide, Diane could clearly hear heavy breathing and every so often a low, tense growl. Coming out of the darkness, the sound of an animal in a state of extreme alertness, but also so exhausted it no longer had the strength left to react forcefully to the presence of people gathering around the place it was hiding. Felix Raymond, with over 20 years of experience as a veterinarian specializing in large wild animals, approached the situation with maximum caution. first using an endoscope camera mounted on a long pole to check on the tiger's condition, without needing to get directly close, avoiding any unnecessary added stress for an animal that had already been in a state of severe panic for days straight. The image from the camera showed the tiger curled up in the farthest corner of the crawl's space, its body trembling slightly, its eyes wide open and fixed on the light coming from outside with an expression mixing alertness and exhaustion that Raymond later described as one of the clearest signs of psychological distress he'd ever witnessed in a full-grown tiger throughout his entire career. The tranquilizing process was carried out with extreme care, using a specialized dart gun with the dosage adjusted based on an estimate of the tiger's body weight from the camera footage, work that demanded a high degree of precision, since too low a dose might not be effective, while too high a dose could put the animal's life at risk, given its already weakened condition after 3 days without proper food. Raymond, positioned at an angle where he could reach a part of the tiger's body through the narrow gap under the barn floor, had to wait nearly 15 minutes to get a proper shot angle, while Diane and the rest of the team stood silently behind him, not daring to make a single sound that might startle the animal into trying to flee again, a situation nobody on the team wanted to have to deal with. When the tranquilizer dart finally hit its mark, striking the tiger in the back of the shoulder, its first reaction was a sharp jolt and a short, pained roar, leaving the whole team tense and waiting through the following seconds, unsure whether the animal might react more violently. But instead, the tiger seemed to only have enough energy left to retreat deeper into the dark corner, and over the next 7 minutes or so, as the sedative began taking effect, the low growling gradually thinned out and finally went completely silent. A silence that Raymond, after checking again with the endoscope camera, confirmed was the sign that the animal had gone fully unconscious and was safe to approach directly without posing any further risk to the team. Getting the tiger out of the tight crawl space beneath the barn floor required the coordinated effort of all 6 members of the rescue team, using a large tarp and specialized rope to carefully pull the animal's heavy body out, taking care to avoid causing any further injury during a move that was already complicated enough given the cramped terrain. Diane, even though she wasn't directly involved in pulling the tiger out, stood watching the entire process with particular attention, trying to note every detail of the animal's physical condition the moment it was brought out into daylight for the first time, after 3 days hiding in the dark. The first thing that surprised Diane and the entire rescue team along with her was the complete absence of any significant external wounds on the tiger's body. Based on what the 7-second clip had captured, a direct confrontation between the tiger and a creature of such overwhelming size and strength, everybody on the team, including Raymond with all his deep professional experience, had expected to find at least some sign of clawing, biting, or blunt force trauma somewhere on the animal's body. But, apart from a few small scrapes on its paws, which looked like the result of moving through rough terrain over 3 days of running rather than from any direct physical struggle, the tiger's body was completely intact, without a single mark of injury that would match what anybody might reasonably expect from a violent confrontation like the one the footage seemed to suggest to everyone who'd seen it. The tiger was transported immediately to a temporary veterinary facility set up nearby, where Raymond and his 2 assistants carried out a comprehensive health examination lasting nearly 3 hours, including full-body X-rays, ultrasounds of its major internal organs, and blood samples drawn for analysis of the most important biochemical markers that could reflect the animal's true condition. The results from this examination, which Raymond later laid out in detail in his official report, and also shared directly with Diane right there on site as the first results started coming in, painted a deeply contradictory picture of the animal's condition, one nobody on the team could have predicted. Purely from a physical standpoint, this tiger is in perfectly good health, Raymond told Diane as the two of them stood outside the temporary examination tent, a folder of freshly printed lab results still in his hand from the portable printer. No broken bones, no internal organ damage, nothing at all indicating a real physical attack actually took place. If I were just looking at the X-ray and ultrasound results, I'd say this was a healthy full-grown tiger, maybe slightly undernourished from 3 days without proper food, but nothing concerning at all in terms of its physical structure or vital organs. But then Raymond pointed to another page in the report, his expression shifting to something far more serious than it had been a few seconds earlier. Here's the issue. Its heart rate, when it was brought in, even after being fully sedated, was still running unusually high compared to a resting baseline for this species, a sign that its sympathetic nervous system was still in a state of extreme activation, even while its body was completely still under the effects of the tranquilizer. And when we analyzed the blood sample, its cortisol levels, the primary stress hormone in mammals, came back nearly 8 times higher than what's considered normal for a tiger, even higher than anything I've ever recorded in an animal that had just gone through an actual attack from a competing predator in a captive environment before. Raymond went on to explain that throughout his career, he'd had the chance to examine plenty of large animals right after they'd been through serious stressful situations, everything from real fights between individuals of the same species competing for territory to animals escaping natural disasters like wildfires or floods. And the cortisol level he was recording in this tiger went far beyond most of those cases, only comparable to a small handful of the most extreme situations he'd ever encountered, usually involving animals that had faced a near certain, unavoidable risk of death. What I find most puzzling, Raymond continued, his voice slower, now as if he were still trying to organize his own thoughts before putting them into words, is the mismatch between this extreme level of physiological stress and the complete absence of any corresponding physical injury. Normally, stress markers at this level come along with at least some sign of trauma, even minor, because an animal's body responding to a genuine survival threat usually involves some kind of fight response, leading to at least some physical contact happening in the process. But here, we have an animal whose physiological readings show it just went through a moment of directly facing death, while its body carries no physical evidence whatsoever of any actual violent encounter having taken place between it and any opponent. Diane stood listening to Raymond's explanation, the vague sense of unease she'd been carrying for weeks now becoming clearer in her mind than it had ever been before. She thought back through every detail of those 7 seconds of footage she'd watched more times than she could count over the past few days. The way the tiger suddenly stopped mid-attack, the way it lowered its body into a posture of submission, never before seen in this species, and the way both animals disappeared from frame heading in the exact same direction, in sync with each other in a way that felt strangely deliberate. Now, with what Raymond had just laid out, she began picturing a possibility she'd never before let herself take seriously. Maybe that confrontation hadn't ended in the 7 seconds captured on camera at all, but had continued on somehow, beyond the reach of any equipment, a confrontation based not on physical violence, but on something else entirely. A purely psychological domination, powerful enough to leave a deep imprint on the tiger's nervous system without needing a single moment of physical contact capable of causing injury throughout the whole encounter. Once the medical examination was complete and the tiger's condition was confirmed stable, the rescue team moved to transport it back to the original facility it had escaped from 3 weeks earlier, this time with a significantly upgraded security. system in place to ensure nothing like this happened again, anytime soon. Diane stood watching the specialized transport truck carrying the tiger, now partially awake but still under light sedation, pull slowly away from Carol Weiss's farm, heading back toward the facility where it would be cared for and monitored over the coming weeks to ensure a full recovery, both physically and mentally, from the deeply haunting experience it had just been through over those 3 days on the run. In that moment, standing alone, at the edge of the dirt road leading away from the farm, Diane couldn't stop turning over the question of what had really happened out in that forest on the night of October 14th. What could have driven an apex predator like a Bengal tiger, a creature with no significant natural enemy anywhere in any environment it had ever known, including its entire life in captivity at the rescue facility, to flee with a level of panic severe enough to carry it nearly 2 miles through complicated forest terrain, and then continue hiding in absolute terror for 3 straight days, never daring to move even a single step out of its makeshift shelter beneath the floor of an abandoned barn, all without carrying a single physical mark to prove that level of extreme fear had actually happened at all. She thought about what Raymond had said, about how psychological domination can sometimes leave a mark far deeper than any ordinary physical wound. And she wondered whether the creature that had appeared in that 7-second clip understood something about the nature of power that even people, with all the complexity of human thought, sometimes struggle to fully grasp, that sometimes the most effective way to assert absolute dominance isn't through direct violence, but through a presence overwhelming enough to make even the fiercest predator in nature accept its lower place in a new order it's just come to recognize, without a single drop of blood having to be spilled to prove it to anyone watching. I want to lay out 2 different ways of understanding this 7-second clip and let them sit side by side through tonight's discussion, because I think both of them deserve a fair hearing before we land on any kind of conclusion. The first understanding holds that this was a confrontation between 2 large animals that ordinary biology can fully explain. Nothing here reaching beyond what natural science has already documented. Maybe it really was an unusually large black bear standing upright, a defensive posture common to the species when facing a threat, and the poor light, along with the camera's angle, exaggerated its size and shape in the eyes of anyone watching, an optical effect that isn't rare at all when observing a large object under near total darkness. The tiger, even as an apex predator in its own natural environment, could absolutely have run from a full-grown bear if it sensed it was at a disadvantage in that confrontation, especially given it was in a completely unfamiliar environment after weeks of wandering, hunger, and disorientation, all factors that could seriously undercut the ordinary confidence and fighting instinct of a big cat used to a life of care and protection. The second way to understand points to details the first explanation has a hard time fully acknowledging. The height of the figure in the footage, when measured against the tiger's relative size standing nearby, goes well beyond the maximum height of any black bear officially recorded in the state of Ohio, based on data the state's Wildlife Management Agency has maintained through decades of tracking the local bear population. And the sound it produced, strong enough to create a faint, measurable vibration on the camera's sensor, a technical detail acoustic specialists confirmed after careful analysis, doesn't match any bear vocalization pattern that researchers have ever recorded and archived in professional North American wildlife biology databases. Looking at it from an animal behavior standpoint, researchers still debate a concept called novel predator response, describing how an apex predator, one without any built-in defensive instinct for a rival species it never evolved alongside over millions of years of evolutionary history, might react in a way completely outside its normal behavioral patterns, including fleeing instead of confronting a threat, even if that predator is normally strong and rarely has to run in its own original natural habitat. This concept usually gets applied to explain the rare cases where invasive species encounter a native predator they've never had experience dealing with before. But it's less often applied to the reverse situation, where a native apex predator itself shows an unusual reaction to a creature mainstream science still hasn't officially recognized the existence of. I'm not planting my flag firmly on either side of these two readings, and I think that's the most honest thing I can tell you tonight. But I want to leave you with one thing, a detail I think matters more than pinning down exactly what species this was. Whatever it was, the thing that confronted that tiger that night chose not to cause it any harm, even though it clearly had every ability to do so during those 7 seconds, when the tiger was fully in a defensive posture with no real capacity left to fight back. The tiger was found panicked, exhausted, disoriented after 3 days on the run, but whole, without a single bite, without a single claw mark, without a single sign that real physical violence had actually taken place. That's the thing that, writing this story out, kept me from simply treating it as a story about power or dominance. If that creature really is what a lot of people in the Bigfoot research community still believe it to be, then what it did that night wasn't the act of a predator defending its territory through violence, but the act of a creature that fully understands the limits of the strength it's holding and chooses to use it in a controlled way, just enough to establish order without ever needing to destroy the thing standing against it. Which reading are you leaning toward? Drop beer or Sasquatch in the comments below and tell me what you believe was standing in that brush that night, and why you're leaning toward that explanation over the other. Remember, 7 seconds was all the camera caught, but sometimes 7 seconds is enough to change how a predator sees the world. I am Victor, and I will see you in the next story.